on this topic क्योंकि market ने बहुत ज़्यादा react किया towards the election years. But that is how markets are. They are irrational in the short term. So when they saw exit polls, they surged up. When they saw results, they surged down. I mean, in neither case was the value of a business changing. The market का ऊपर जाना नीचे जाना had no correlation to the business itself.
Welcome to the new episode of Chai Pe Kharcha. In this episode, we have a very interesting topic, and it has a recency bias also. We've just had the results of Indian election. Topic today is what would be our reaction to personal financial decisions based on what we've seen as the result of the elections. This will be a subjective conversation. None of us are political experts or financial experts, but this is our perspective on how we see things panning out. I will start with Rohit. Rohit, आप क्या विचार क्या हैं आपके?
First of all, I think I'll kind of chronologically समझाता हूँ guys. So obviously
समझिए आप सब
chronology समझिए. सबसे पहले तो it was a very shocking thing for me because as I'm assuming most of you and most of the people around the world were expecting कि BJP and the NDA government will come in with like a super majority. That's what I was observing in the market, and like markets were basically just climbing up on that expectation. So the first reaction was shock that what we had expected, what everyone had expected, is not what the reality was. That shock also manifested in a very sharp market downfall. I think like 5 or 6% approximately is what the market fell down on Tuesday. That felt like an opportunity. There was definitely some part of me which was becoming a little greedy and saying कि यार आज market गिरा है फट से इसमें थोड़ा पैसा डालते हैं. Maybe अभी 2-3 दिन the market will probably continue falling. But thankfully, I think partly through this podcast and everything that we have learned about psychology and behavior and being disciplined, I was like, I have a specific plan. I have my SIPs. Let me continue running that. And whatever happens in the market, I don't want to be affected by it. But the one thing that I did do, and this is a general practice with or without elections that people might want to take on, is that every year you should try and increase how much money you are investing into your long-term equity portfolio. So just this week itself, I spoke with my financial advisor and I increased my SIP amount almost by like 30%. So पिछले साल मैं जितना डाल रहा था, इस साल I'm putting in 30% more money every single month just to kind of bolster that long-term growth and everything else. How am I changing my perspective on investment in India and the long-term profile of India? I feel like the basic fundamentals of the country are not going to change, whether there is a BJP government or some other government or an NDA government or whatever. What can happen is short-term fluctuations in policies, but I think the momentum that has been created, a lot of that is very organic momentum. There is amazing human capital in India. There's a lot of infrastructure that is being developed, and like basically that train has left the station. तो वो जो वेव है उसको वापस डिप या कंट्रोल नहीं किया जा सकता. मे बी द स्ट्रेंथ ऑफ दैट वेव विल go up and go down a little, but I think the long term aspect remains intact, and therefore my long term plans of investment in India and outlook of India also remains mostly intact. However, I have started to become slightly risk averse because the markets are just going up and there is just no point where I feel like कि कोई तरह का rationalization आ रहा है. So I do find myself sometimes wondering if I'm trapping myself by continuously investing in a market which does not seem to have any kind of a cap or any kind of a logic that is driving. That's my thought for now.
सर सवाल
Please.
आपने बोला आप पैसे बढ़ा रहे हो, बोला आप रिस्क कवर भी हो रहे हो, ये कैसे डाइकोटमस रिप्लाई हो गया?
डाइकोटमस हो गया. बहुत ही यही यही जो अंदर की दुविधा है मेरी, वो इसी डाइकोटमी में. तो SIP अमाउंट बढ़ाने का लॉजिक ये है कि अगर आपका एक बहुत ही लॉन्ग टर्म पोर्टफोलियो है, यू आर लुकिंग एट 10-20 years ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट horizon, then irrespective of what happens in the short term, the conventional wisdom or the expert wisdom basically says you should increase your investment amount. Obviously, हमारा अभी इस साल earlier in the year some increment happened, some bonus came in, different happened, and I have extra cash available to me जिसका मेरे कंजम्पशन में कोई यूज नहीं, तो दैट इज प्योरली गोइंग इनटू सेविंग्स, और वो बैंक में पड़े रहने से अच्छा आई वुड रादर पार्क इट इन इक्विटी. So that's the reason behind increasing my SIP allocation. However, जो fear है, which like as any person would be susceptible, I consume a lot of the news that happens. I look at my market and my portfolio every few days, and it does trigger some kind of a fear in my mind. Is it becoming excess? Is it becoming a bubble? And you can't really shut it down because just the world that we live in. यूट्यूब पे देखो आप, इंस्टाग्राम पे देखो, न्यूज चैनल चला लो, whatever content you're consuming, it is giving you some kind of a signal into what is happening in the world and what is happening in the economy. So it is very hard to not get affected by it. But basically, how do you balance between a disciplined process and how do you use that discipline to kind of counteract some of your fears, but at the same time, not become ostrich with your head in the sand, and take tactical decisions and kind of be very agile with how you want to play the market. So another example for that is I have increased my investment in gold, for instance. So as a hedge against equity, because I have some extra cash in hand, I am also purchasing some gold to kind of try and counteract कि अगर equity में कुछ होता है तो hopefully gold will save me a little bit in that case.
और MBA टाइप रिप्लाई दिया सर. चल
Professional sir.
प्रोफेशनल.
इस चीज में एक्सपर्ट है.
सही बात. जी मधवेश, आप बताओ, आपने कैसे विचार बदले अपने कि नहीं बदले?
मेरा विचार तो थोड़ा तो बदला ही है. रीजन बीइंग कि मेरा रीडिंग है कि मार्केट तो ऑलवेज एक्सपेक्टेशन और उसका आउटकम पे ही चलता है. तो एक्सपेक्टेशन था कि बीजेपी अपने आप पे मेजॉरिटी ले लेगा, बट वो तो हुआ नहीं, इसलिए गिरा. बट इफ यू लुक एट द पिक्चर मोर क्लोजली, क्या गिरा मोर versus the overall stock portfolios, the ones which BJP favored, like the Adani stocks, and sectors with BJP favored, which is like infrastructure, say L&D or सब गिरा. But certain stocks still held or like fell very less. So this in itself gives us a story of like what should be the way forward in this scenario. तो जैसे अगर इंडिया है तो ऑफकोर्स, एंड ये ऑल्सो एक लर्निंग मुझे लगा कि वी वेर थिंकिंग द इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इज गोइंग अप, रोड्स हो रहा है, ये सब हो रहा है. बट दिस इलेक्शन रिजल्ट एक्चुअली brought up the real story of rural India, where there's like lot of district, right? Like जैसे जॉब्स कम हो रहा है, ये अग्निवीर की वजह से बहुत लोगों को एम्प्लॉयमेंट नहीं मिल रहा है. तो व्हाट द इंडियन पब्लिक इज ऑल्सो एक्सपेक्टिंग, वो भी आपको समझ में है कि तो गवर्नमेंट उस पर इन्वेस्ट करने वाला है, जैसे मोर सब्सिडीज, मोर कंजम्पशन रिलेटेड सब्सिडीज एक्सेट्रा. तो FMCG कंपनीज सब पे रख के मेरा सोच यही था कि इंडिया का मैक्रो स्टोरी, जो भी गवर्नमेंट आया है, इंडिया तो अच्छा करने वाला है, ठीक है, बट गवर्नमेंट का पॉलिसी इज गोइंग टू एक्ट एज कैटलिस्ट. तो उसके हिसाब से ये कोalition गवर्नमेंट तो मुझे बेटर ही लग रहा है, एंड आई डोंट सी दिस कोalition गवर्नमेंट ब्रेकिंग, because even though there are two major partners with BJP, but BJP itself has a good majority, even though it did not cross 270. So I don't see this breaking. Policy making might change. ये सब पे याद रखें, now we need to balance our portfolio. अगर our previous portfolio was geared towards infrastructure and related stocks, we need to bring in FMCG stock. थोड़ा banking stocks तो आना ही है, because the macro story is that we are going to have more middle class than what we have currently. तो मिडिल क्लास इंक्रीज हुआ तो कंजम्पशन इंक्रीज होगा, तो स्टॉक सब ऊपर जाने ही वाला. एंड एज रोहित ऑल्सो सेड ही वाज वेरी कॉशियस, बट as I have done previously in my investing experience, a fall was also a good opportunity to buy certain stock whose story is not going to change. I can actually give an example कि मैंने Zomato खरीदा.
because I know I missed an opportunity when the IPO came. But I am sure with the level of execution they are going on, and Blinkit is going to be one of the big parts of the market. I see Zomato going up very high in the near future and in the long term based on their management. So, and to bring in cautious approach here, what I did was, again, what we have discussed in the previous episodes, कि अगर आपको 100% का एक अमाउंट है, उसपे से 20% अभी डाल, and as the price increases, you increase to your. तो मैंने मेरा 10% of the Zomato gold में मैंने खरीद, and as we can see, Zomato is again back to the price before June 5th जो था वो आ गया. So, in summary, macro picture intact. Micro picture थोड़ा change हो रहा है because what the Indian public in general itself is expecting. So change your strategy based on some of the sectors which are undervalued currently, like FMCG. Reduce exposure to industries like the PSUs, which is BJP or very.
Before we move on, a very disclaimer, this is not financial advice. Zomato, हम नहीं बोल रहे भाई ले लो, ना ही हम और कुछ बोल रहे हैं कि ये हमारा अप्रोच है. This is not financial advice. We are not influencers. Just fine.
Thanks, that's it. ये सब मेरा सोच है, मेरा सोच तो गलत हो सकता है, तो नुकसान सिर्फ मेरा रहेगा.
हाँ.
तो ये मैं
अपना
बोल रहा हूँ,
नुकसान मत
सब लोग
कीजिए.
अपना ड्यू डिलिजेंस कीजिए.
ईशान,
So from me, there's no change in outlook because I don't see that there's a big change in government. There is obviously a change moving from a single party having a majority to a coalition government, but I think from a policy perspective, don't expect them right to make changes. More importantly, I think we started off on this topic क्योंकि market ने बहुत ज़्यादा react किया towards the election years. But that is how markets are. They are irrational in the short term. So when they saw exit polls, they surged up. When they saw results, they surged down. I mean, in neither case was the value of a business changing. The market का ऊपर जाना नीचे जाना had no correlation to the business itself, which is why what Madhvi said made a lot of sense. If there was a good business that you liked, इसका तो मैं एक वैल्यूएशन कर रखा है, तो मैं पता है कि ये बिजनेस का इतना अगर शेयर प्राइस होगा तो मैं ले सकता हूँ. When the market was going down, that is a good time to get in. But it doesn't mean the value of the business has changed. The one thing I do disagree with, which Rohit had mentioned, and I'm not picking on Rohit, this is a very common theme I've seen on social media. A lot of people on different podcasts saying that India ka growth story cannot be stopped. India ka growth story is irrespective of what happens. Probably because I'm slightly older than all of you, but also because I remember the previous coalition governments and also the like not just coalition, but previous governments before that. Growing up in households where the news plays 24/7, you tend to hear a lot of things. I think it's sometimes to trigger growth, to have that catalyst, strong governments are very important, which I think we had with one single party leading it. I'm not saying good, bad for the markets. They were very important for the economy. I think they've helped. This growth that has happened, we can differ on whether it had started pre-2014 or it accelerated post-2014. I'm sure everyone can pick up data points and have conversations. I think to keep it going was important. But to say कि क्या कोई भी government आएगी वो नहीं रुकेगा, I think that I find very controversial because we have seen policies from governments, we have seen decisions from governments in the past which have been detrimental to any kind of growth, to any kind of development for the country. बहुत सारा कुछ जो, like Madhvesh mentioned, a few sectors that the government is focused on. Now, there are other sectors, obviously, the government should focus on. It shouldn't just be limited to this. But those are important sectors for the growth of the country. Right? Infrastructure is very important. अमेरिका में जब भी कोई अमेरिकन प्रोग्राम सुनो तो वो इसी में रोते रहते हैं कि हम इंफ्रा पे कोई स्पेंड नहीं कर रहे, डिफेंस पे बहुत स्पेंड करते हैं. जबकि वी हैव नो नेबर अटैकिंग अस. दे स्पेंड मोर ऑन डिफेंस देन इंडिया दैट हैज neighbors on either border who are not friendly. So we are at least focused on the right sectors, in some of the right sectors with this government. So there at least the growth will show. But you never know if another government was to come in place. If that focus shifted, will that help the businesses grow in the country? Will they be startup friendly? Will they focus on Make in India? Atmanirbhar India. If any of those programs are relatively successful also, or have helped small businesses grow, the Mudra schemes, for example, when they were giving out loans to start off your businesses, those things have helped. Those things have created some value in the entire ecosystem, the business chains. So that is the one thing that the government would have changed. I think I would have paused and I would have relooked at what is their plan, because I do think some of the statements they made leading up to the elections about redistribution of wealth, which again was hyped and then played down. If that is a thought in someone's head of how we want to do things, how we look at rich people, how we look at people making money, some of those things were scary, especially for businesses. So maybe not for us because we sit outside, so we might be still safe and secure. But how will the markets react to some of those policies? I think that would make me rethink my investment decisions in India. So, but Abhi, like, I agree, it's a coalition government. There might be some more constraints on BJP in what they want to do, but I don't see major policy changes coming.
मुझे एक और पॉइंट ऐड करना था. मुझे लग रहा है वन ऑफ द इम्पोर्टेंट रीडिंग्स कि ऐसा बीजेपी को अभी मैंडेट कम हुआ है, and the two partners that they are dependent on is JDU, which is basically from Bihar, and the other party is from Andhra, which needs a new city, new capital. I feel this is going to provide more impetus for the reason being that I have a big believer of human capital is the best strength that India has. And most of the human capital in India is concentrated on the Hindi belt, which is basically UP, Bihar. The loss in UP, which BJP suffered, and an important coalition partner from Bihar, is going to make BJP focus more of its strength on those areas, which might lead to more human capitalization, more opportunities for them. And this is going to add on to the India growth story. And Chandrababu Naidu is someone who is seen as a tech-enabled leader. He knows how to build cities from ground up. So having that expertise can lead to many more Amaravatis across India, which I think is the need of the hour. We cannot just depend on 4 or 5 metros and bring all the public. So those cheeses is going to have a big play. And this will also help us to identify sectors or stocks, which we need to focus on based on. So again,
I lived in Hyderabad. I can talk from experience. I lived for a very short time, but I've lived there. Seeing the high-tech city area where now all the tech offices are, and we've all heard how big tech companies are trying to invest more and bring more talent into India, and especially in these places between Bangalore and Hyderabad. I think one more metro of that size coming up will obviously not happen instantly. It will take time. It might take 20 years for it to be built. But we can see a constant stream of investment coming in for that time, because we at least know that there is a guy who's going to try and build it there. And he has done it before. So we are obviously going by previous track record, just like we would do with company management. कि इन्होंने पहले जो कंपनी चलाई थी उसमें इस तरह से किया था, अच्छा चला था. In a very similar vein, if he focuses on the same stuff and says, I want to build another tech capital here, I think that in itself would bring in even more investment, even more jobs into that area, which I think can only be good for both the market and the country.
There was an interesting article I was reading recently in the last couple of days after the election results came out. And it was basically comparing the history of India over the last 30, 35 years. And it was showing the progress in terms of economic growth of the stock market under single party governments and under coalition governments. So single party government, I think there are two big examples. One, obviously, the BJP government in the last 10 years. And the other one is Rajiv Gandhi's government back in pre-1990, 84 to 89 wala period. And uske beech ka jo pura time, mostly that was coalition government. According to that article, India, purely by numbers, performed better under coalition parties as compared to single government parties. Couple of specific examples that the article called out was that the Indian financial crisis, which led to the 1991 reforms of opening up the Indian market, was in a large part perpetuated by the single party government. That obviously led to the growth of India as a country, as an economy that we see today. Like 1991 was the foundation of all of that happening. Similarly, they compared the growth of the stock market in percentage terms under the UPA government versus the last 10 years. So purely percentage terms ke basis pe, it, according to the article, and I haven't cross-checked the facts here, but according to the article, the stock market percentage basis mein, it grew more during the tenure of the coalition government versus the tenure of the single party government. Obviously, NDA was the ruling coalition, but BJP did have supermajority there, right? And another very interesting example that the article quoted was a decision like demonetization, which made the country go through such a hard time. And it can be debated whether that actually led to any kind of benefit or not. The article basically poses the question ki if it was a strong coalition and if there was a strong opposition in place, would a government have been able to take a decision like demonetization without considering maybe 50 other things? And maybe that could have been done in a different way or could have been done in a better way in order to achieve the objectives they were going for, but not cause as much pain as they actually ended up causing, and the destruction of wealth or sort of hitting the brakes on the economy for a short time that happened because of demonetization. So that I think was a very interesting article, and we'll try to find that and link that in. Ishan.
Yeah, I think a lot of focus is on the fact that it's going to be a coalition government. I think even Madhvesh pointed out the fact that there are only two major partners that they have, which give them the majority. And I'm sure they'll collect enough independence along the way. It's not going to, they're not going to be heavily dependent if one partner turns away. So I don't necessarily see that being as big a factor. But the point that you made about there being a strong opposition, I think that was critical for a lot of reasons beyond just the financial markets. In a democracy, it is important that there is a strong opposition, and we can debate on the quality of leaders we have in the strong opposition. But at least there is now enough of a quorum in parliament where there will be enough people who can make noise if procedures aren't being followed or something like a demonetization happens again, which has impacted their own performance in the last 10 years on how much the economy has grown. I think that was a big hit on their growth numbers. The one thing it did bring out was the very fast shift to digital payments in India, which may in the long run be a boon for the country. But I don't know what, maybe someone will do a PhD at some point and come out of this.
Law of unintended consequences, right? There's this phenomenon. You do something and you have no idea that something else is going to
The
happen.
consequences, the unintended consequences of it, we keep finding out. But yeah, at least the digital payment ecosystem really grew out of it, which led to a lot of fintechs. So hopefully soon we will see a lot of those IPOs coming in and our market booms even more.
एक और चीज मैं ऐड करना चाह रहा हूँ ये what Rohit mentioned would be एक additional lens चाहिए. Agree कि absolute returns पे the previous Manmohan Singh government 10 साल के लिए ज्यादा था. But if you look at sustainability of that growth, Abhi is much better than what it was. Back then, the balance sheets of companies were not that great. They were borrowing at a crazy, unchecked level. The banks were just lending without doing due diligence and stuff. But Abhi, if you compare, of course, there is a lot of financial discipline across the board. The PSU banks have recovered really well. The NPAs are really low. So I think the sustainability in terms of returns is much better now. Of course, there are going to be volatility with stocks like Adani because they are borrowing more and they are led to borrow more just because of the government backing that they have. So you need to be more careful when looking at those stocks. But in general, across the market, the fiscal discipline is much better as well as with the government. They don't just give a subsidy just for a vote in return is what I think.
Perfect. Yeah. I don't even want to give my point of view. I'm not well read enough in this area. So I will not
But
try.
we will want to understand, Sid, if you have not been super plugged into all the election noise and everything else,
Right.
how does that affect your thinking process in terms of your investment decisions?
It doesn't. I'm actually, it's what Chan mentioned, and I think both of you also mentioned, ki I think BJP is still forming the government. Yes, they'll have some opposition, but the policies will more or less be very similar to what has happened. So unless there would have been a very, say, Aam Aadmi Party ekdam deep gayi hoti hai sab, then maybe I would have thought about it. But I think there is not much change, and I am not well read as a sector. Take it with a pinch of salt. But to your point, no change in the decision. I also, there's something that we touched upon in between game. For the long run, ये movements in the stock market will normalize. वैसे भी अपन SIP कर रहे हैं, म्यूचुअल फंड में ऐसे तो बैठ के स्टॉक खरीद नहीं रहे. There's nothing much changing for me at least. But thank you to our audience for watching the episode, and stay tuned for our next episode.